Hello and welcome. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Business Today Television's live coverage from the ground at the G20 Summit venue in the International Media Center. Day 2, it's 3 o'clock. Much of the action that was expected to take today took place yesterday. And I'm going to tell you viewers about the key points so far, the top 20 key items that have been accomplished at the G20 so far. The first really, the unanimous adoption of the Delhi Declaration, and if we could, we would add that it happened one day ahead of expectations. India managed to counter the objections of China and ensured that several of the key agenda items went through. This is obviously the first declaration to be adopted so unanimously, with so much unanimity. In terms of specific achievements, the launch of the Global Biofuels Alliance, an agreement to build a crypto regulation framework, more funding for nations, those who are troubled by debt, better, bigger, effective multilateral development banks, again work in progress, but some more steps in that regard. Overall, a huge diplomatic victory for the Indian government. Bilateral talks with as many as 15 powerful nations, getting them all here, playing host to them. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, again, very, very important announcement. Discussions with Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations. Financing of climate change as one of the other important factors. A G20 satellite mission. India's digital prowess showcased here. A framework for DPI also discussed and accepted. Progress on sustainable development goals, among others. And of course, the India-US bilateral with several key notable points, including the 6G alliance that will hopefully ensure that not only will a new physical corridor, the connectivity corridor, connect India with the West, with the United States, with the European Union, and counter China. A digital framework will also in some ways counter China, which has been setting the standards in 6G. To discuss all that has been accomplished so far, and it's been absolutely 2 days of action-packed news flow, I'm joined by our experts once again. Very delighted to welcome Pramit Chaudhuri, the practice head South Asia at the Eurasia Group. Welcome, Pramit. Gautam Chikermane, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation, joins us again. Welcome once again. And with me, my colleague Surabhi, Economy Editor at Business Today. Viewers will also be joined by other guests as we continue rolling coverage from here. But Pramit, I'm coming to you. For the person who is trying to enjoy his Sunday afternoon, and that doesn't include you, me, and others who are here at the venue, how should they recap what has happened so far and what has been accomplished? Pramit Chaudhuri.
I would argue Prime Minister Modi had gone into the G20 with a broad focus. The core focus was a green G20. Multilateral development bank reform to massively expand green finance to emerging economies and the global south, which at present are not getting actually all that much money. Most of the money in green finance is going from rich countries to rich countries. Second, the biofuels alliance that you mentioned provide the global south an alternative to the very expensive electrical vehicle transition. His own life program for a more, if you wish, frugal and carbon-sensitive lifestyle. And finally, the green hydrogen standards discussion. The global south element, though, overlaps with this, but there's now, as you've mentioned, a digital global public infrastructure program. And the idea of providing the global south a sense that the international system is trying to respond to their special concerns. I would argue that on MDB reform, he's more or less got the G20 to endorse that. The next step is for the second report of the working group to come out in October before the baton is handed over to Brazil for the next G20. But I think you will start to see Western countries and the major development banks start to change their structures to provide that finance. That'll be huge. You're looking at something as much as $500 billion a year in extra finance to the global south for climate. And that's both globally important as well as regionally important. The biofuels has been agreed upon, but it has been handed over to Brazil. That's their specialization, and they would like to be the ones to make it the final, take that to the last mile. Green hydrogen we're still talking about. I think though, and then global digital infrastructure, we've seen public infrastructure, we've seen an agreement on the basic principles for the first time, and India is now building its own One Future alliance around this concept, and we'll hope to see that expand over time. But that's something India can sell. So we've been able to showcase India's both its capabilities as well as diplomatic influence. And I think the fact that we were able to get bridging language on Ukraine, the most difficult political issue of the G20, is also a statement to India's diplomatic capacities in this area.
Gautam Chikermane, Prime Minister Modi's big G20 win being interpreted as showing the United States and the Europe are working very closely with India and with the global south, and also working to counter China's rise, a common concern really for the US as well as for India. Gautam, how would you describe the top three takeaways from your perspective of the achievements that have been unveiled?
I think the fact that we have some sort of a leaders' communique at the end of the discussions is itself a very big deal. If you recall, in our last talk, many were skeptical, including me. We were skeptical of whether we will be able to get the declaration going. We expected that since Xi Jinping would not be attending, since Putin is not attending, it probably means the two are together and are going to put spanner in the works. That has not happened. I think that clearly shows the persuasive abilities of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in particular, and the G20 diplomacy in general. And the fact that I don't think we are fighting anybody in G20. There are fights, there are tensions between nations, and they exist. But at G20, what I find more interesting, I would not like to frame this as a West versus China or West versus Russia. I would like to look at it as India being India bringing some sort of a multipolarity, the multipolar world that we keep talking about, from a unipolar to a bipolar, and the moving towards multipolarity. In G20 this time, I think India has provided that multipolarity by getting both Ukraine and Europe, the ideas of Ukraine and Europe in those four paragraphs, and as well as China and Russia. So I think this is what great diplomacy is all about. Without this, there would have been no declaration at all. So I think this is the first very big thing that has happened. Digital public infrastructure, another very big takeaway, as Pramit just mentioned. And I think that the fact that we are looking, firstly, we are mentioning a digital public infrastructure. Secondly, we are seeking safe, secure, trusted, accountable, inclusive, etc., inclusivity into that infrastructure, and how to execute that infrastructure through the creation of a framework on the one side, and India holding and hosting the global digital public infrastructure repository on the other. So I think that's another big thing. It's the creation of another public good, global public good, that India has now offered after the major one, which is the free vaccines. I think we should not miss talking about FATF. Not that something else, something extra has been done other than small arms regulation, but the fact that the pressure on terrorists and terror supporting institutions, including nations, remains, and I think we should continue to put our weight out there. The fact that it may or may not do, or in terms of support from the various people, not be as effective as India would like it to be, is a different matter. But at a global level, at a multilateral, at a G20 level, I think this is another good work in progress. The fact that the G20, I just want to take one last 1 minute, Siddharth. G20 was made or was actioned strongly in the 2008 Washington meet, where it became the global board of directors for the global economy. Since then, it has been losing track. Sometimes you're talking about Ebola virus, sometimes you're talking about sustainability, all other kinds of things, all things that belong to the realm of United Nations and geopolitical affairs have been put into G20. This shows that G20 is gathering momentum as a strong body, but it lacks the legitimacy of a United Nations. So I think the fact that the economic focus has come back into the G20, despite it being lost in the debris of various tensions such as US, China, India, Ukraine, Russia, EU, and several others, I think that's one very big deal.
Okay, that's a very comprehensive summary. Surabhi, I'm coming to you with regard to the key takeaways. I remember you telling us soon after the Delhi Declaration that the Multilateral Development Bank detailing in the declaration was one of the most significant. You've now had occasion to go through the fine print. What would you describe as the top two key takeaways from the G20 so far?
To put it in context, about 10 of the finance track agenda items, they turned into outcomes and have found place in the overall Delhi Declaration. But when we talk about the two most important, most significant agenda items, I would definitely say that it is the MDB reforms and the endorsement of the IMF FSB paper on cryptocurrency regulation. Because as officials were pointing out today also, there is scope for more discussions on this next month in October at the IMF World Bank meeting, and it will lead to a more concrete roadmap on how to go about both of these things.
Okay. Pramit, I come to you. Just a while back, I had three senior people from India's telecom industry go into the fine print of the 6G alliance with the United States. Again, China, a leader in 6G, 40% of the patents in that space, they have investing billions of dollars, adding AI capability, again, very, very powerful there. And now the India and United States working at both standard setting and hopefully with elements of manufacturing from a trust and secure network perspective. With the physical corridor and this telecom partnership, would it be correct to say that as far as India's partnership choices are concerned, in infrastructure and in telecom and technology, the US is now the most significant and important player?
I would say definitely so, especially should I say US and allies. As you correctly said, our rollout, for example, of our 5G and our future 6G, there is no Chinese presence, and that is deliberate. Huawei, ZTE have been either banned or disallowed from being part of that. A lot of the present, there are 140, I think, Chinese companies now facing customs and tax investigation by the Indian authority. It's got nothing to do with customs or tax. It has to do with data theft. Our PLI and medical devices, all of that is really designed at the national security level designed to reduce our dependence on Chinese products. So across the board, in almost every technological front, we can see, especially those involving data, India is working very hard to get rid of a Chinese footprint or dependency. And the Quad, which in many ways I would argue is now the number one or number two foreign policy grouping that India now is involved in, is about strategic technology. It is four governments getting together and saying we do not want in China to be either our primary source of technology, cutting edge technology, AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, and we don't want China to be our primary source. We don't want China to be dominant, and we will struggle to do something about it. And that's why you're seeing, if you look at the Modi-Biden summit in July, it's really a technological summit. It is a giant technological agreement, semiconductors, quantum computing, and so on. And it says so in the first or second paragraph. That technology is now going to be the heart of the US-India relationship in a strategic sense, more than anything else. And we're going to keep seeing that. I recently met some Taiwanese diplomats and I said, why are Taiwanese companies coming to India? They said, because Washington told us to come. We don't actually think you're ready for our technology, but we have been told to come here for geopolitical reasons. So we're here. So you're seeing this relationship grow at the same time where the decoupling of India and China on the technology front is accelerating to the extent that it is possible to do so. And I think this is record. In many ways, we are ahead of the Americans already in a degree to which we've cut off our relationship with the Chinese in electronics. And I think within the G20, to some degree, this was also evident. When I've talked to diplomats who are in the room from different countries, they say what was striking was every time there was a discussion, India would propose, America would second, China would then oppose. And it became a battle between these three. In every single case, the Americans pushed really hard on behalf of India. They said, we fully support India. MDB reforms. The Europeans, a lot of the Europeans didn't like the idea, dilute their position. America jumped on them and said, no, you accept the Indian position. There is no common Western position as far as this is concerned.
That's a very good way to describe a very important development. Gautam, explain to our viewers whether we should conclude that within the G20, it's the US and India which are now having the most important, most effective and most watched tango. And as you answer that question, viewers, I just want to add to what Pramit said. The geo network in India, and I had reported this several years ago, had early on decided that not even a single screw of that very expensive broadband network that so many millions of Indians enjoy will have any origin from China. And that is the extent of clarity that many operators have when it comes to trusted networks. But Gautam, the question on the India-US Tango and what it really means for the Aam Aadmi.
So that is correct. And what you mentioned, what Pramit just spoke about, I think not allowing China in 5G upwards technology into various rollouts is not only the Indian position. It began with Australia. India was number 2. Europe then followed, then America followed, and then one country after another, Europe, almost the entire Europe has banned 5G in one way or another, except Germany and France, which are the largest economies in EU. So the danger with 5G onwards is the level of intrusion that they are technologically capable of. Combine that with the 5 laws that China has enacted between 2017 and 2022, for instance, the National Intelligence Law, which has effectively turned every entity of China, every organization in China, every citizen of China into a spy. Yeah, there are 4 clauses, for instance, Articles 8 and 9 and 12 and 13 of the National Intelligence Law, which have effectively turned every individual or entity into a spy. Combine that spying legal requirement with a 5G kind of infrastructure, and what you have is that China would be controlling the entire data of the world, spying ruthlessly on any and every person, just as the way they do in their own country. The fact that India has led this clearly is another leadership that India has provided alongside Australia, followed by US and then Europe. As far as India and US go, I don't think we are at the G2 moment just yet. We may be getting there, and in terms of a moral compass, in terms of delivering new ideas, in terms of the sheer potential of India as a $10 trillion economy, almost around the corner, 7 trillion within this decade, and 3 trillion on top of that over the next 5 years or 3 years, is inevitable. So I think America, like the smart nation that it is looking at the long term. Europe, on the other hand, is a short-term nation. They are still engaged deeply with China. They still, despite they continue to call China a strategic competitor or some expression, and yet they continue to invest in China and continue to open their markets to China. At some point, this is going to smash their faces, and that time is going to come sooner rather than later. In all this, I think
but Gautam, do they really have an alternative? Do American companies have an alternative to this because of the way the supply chains were constructed over the last 3 decades?
I think given the technology, given the pace of action on those technology, given the quick pace of delivery on the new technologies, getting new supply chains in place may not be as difficult and may not take as much time as they did earlier. The process is on. And for instance, India's second largest trade partner continues to be China. But this time, I think the kind of products that we are importing for them are value-added products, for instance, inputs into mobile phones, etc. So I think what the world is saying is, as far as teddy bears and T-shirts go, China is okay. Whenever it comes to technologies, China is not okay. And we need new supply chains, new collaborations. And it is in that perspective that India and the US needs to be seen, combined with a long-term India, 10, 15-year India, where India is a $10 trillion economy with adequate weight, economic weight behind it.
A wonderful description for teddy bears and T-shirts. China is okay, but when it comes to technology, it is the United States. Before I go to Surabhi and then Pramit, I just want to quickly play out what Department of Economic Affairs Secretary Ajay Seth told my colleague Karishma Sudani just a little while back on the sidelines of the summit.
Joining me is Secretary Economic Affairs, Mr. Ajay Seth. Sir, thank you so much on this conversation. Congratulations, India's G20 presidency quite taken a shape. 10 deliverables under the finance track that have been, of course, formed a consensus. What is the plan of action, especially keeping in mind you have another 1.5 months until the presidency? Where do you see the roadmap taking forward, especially with the next FMCBG meeting happening?
I missed your first part of your question. This is on the crypto assets?
No, it's completely on the 10 deliverables of the finance track.
Okay. Say that we have each of the working groups would be meeting, and the first set of meetings are starting on 14th of this month itself, where the GPFI would be meeting in Mumbai. So first we have to take it forward that the recommendations which have got endorsed by the ministers, there will be deliberation that how to take them forward. Then the next set of recommendation would be where still some work needs to be done. For example, MDB reforms, strengthening MDBs, and we would be expecting leaders have said that they look forward to receiving the second volume of independent expert group report would be coming. That will come up for discussion. Certainly that crypto roadmap, taking it forward in a swift manner and deliberating upon how to get it beyond G20 membership, that will also come up for discussion. So there's a fair amount of work which needs to be done in the coming months.
Great. So one quick last question, and this is on the climate resilient debt clause. Of course, this was on the negotiation table for long. Was there a problem? Because if you're talking about the debt vulnerability as one of the schemes and keeping in mind that climate has been the core agenda and crux of the discussions, do we see any movement on this, especially for the developing countries?
Perhaps it will not be correct to say that this has been on the table for long. This has been discussed couple of years in the past. In Gandhinagar, a couple of members have said it is a time to think it very careful, have a careful look at it. At the same time, other members felt that this particular piece of work requires a more technical work in terms of assessing and then how it will be evaluated and so on. So it was felt that International Financial Architecture Working Group, IFA, in their coming meetings, not necessarily in September meeting, will be dwelling upon this issue or will dwell upon this issue in a little more detail.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
That was the Economic Affairs Secretary speaking about some of the key points there. Meanwhile, we are hearing from the French President that France supports a deep reform of global institutions like the United Nations Security Council, the World Bank and the IMF. Surabhi, I am coming to you on the point that we were discussing earlier. Our experts giving us different views. But to continue forward with the implementation of some of these announcements, very ambitious, what is the timeline that you can share with our viewers as to when will some of these bear fruit in the near future?
So So as of now, there doesn't seem to be a very clear timeline if you look at things like the MDB reforms, because the second volume of the report is supposed to come, which is going to be more granular on how to go about with these, reforms. And officials were also saying that there is also talk going on quota reforms, which is another important part of the MDB reforms, but slightly different from what the report is talking about. So that's also likely to be taken up. On cryptocurrency regulations, it's expected that there's going to be more discussion at the G20, then there'll have to be more discussions, among countries beyond the G20, because officials have been pointing out, and this has also been India's stand, that no one country can regulate cryptocurrencies because of the very nature of these assets. So it has to be done on a more global scale and in a more unified way. And on other reforms such as financial inclusion and digital public infrastructure, officials have said that countries are free to develop their own DPIs and take forward financial inclusion efforts, or else they can work with India, and India is always willing. So these are all talks in progress, and we'll have to wait and watch over the next few years.
A quick follow-up before I let you go. There are bilaterals scheduled, including one with Saudi Arabia. There is going to be discussions, and the Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal is also going to hold talks. At least that's the understanding that we have. Can you tell our viewers as to what is expected after the summit day today, beginning tomorrow?
As you rightly pointed out, there are likely to be more talks on with Saudi Arabia, and bilaterals are continuing. We expect more. There's a press conference also, I believe, scheduled on this, and I think the Biofuel Alliance, there is more work going on that, and obviously these bilaterals will lead to a lot more trade and investment discussions, and hopefully it'll culminate into more activity on the ground.
All right, more work for all of us. And you, Surabhi, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. Let's also welcome in at this stage market expert Ajay Bhaga, who is joining us live. Ajay, a very warm welcome to the studio, the Business Today television setup at the International Media Center. We've been here for the last 3 days, and I've been noticing your tweets on the outcome so far. So tell our viewers what excites you the most, because there isn't much directly for the stock markets, but markets work on sentiment, and if sentiment were to be the key benchmark on which we were to judge the G20 outcome, I believe it would be right up there at the top. Ajay Bhaga.
Yeah, Siddharth, absolutely. And getting a consensus on the communique. No nation signs up to language which is not palatable to their domestic political class or their domestic interests. So getting this done itself is big. We should not underestimate it. The signaling that has gone on the global south by including the African Union, getting such a big segment on the table on this platform is huge. The Global Biofuels Alliance that is announced, all these are having a lot of potential, and then the direct potential of the Europe, Middle East, India linkage. That has multifarious potentialities. Of course, now the execution comes in. What the market would look at quite clearly, I think it's the opportunity set, it's the trust and the goodwill that India has built up in the global south, be it supplying defense equipment to Southeast Asia or to Africa, being the pharmacy of the world, being the generic medicine capital of the world, and allowing our educational institutions to set up their branches abroad. So on a lot of parameters, Indian companies at least get access to the markets. A lot will depend on execution. But we must remember, at the height of the COVID, our Exim Bank had extended lines to 44 African countries. Even now, Sri Lanka, we extended huge lines and direct bilateral assistance in its debt relief measures. So India is in a position to be a supplier of capital, to be a supplier of technology, and also of execution skills. And one final thing would be the digital public infrastructure, where we have had a fantastic run in India. World Bank just came out with its report, which is showing that what could have taken 47 years has taken 6 years, nearly $33 billion of savings being made by the direct benefit transfers. So India has that awesome track record on the digitalization of public infrastructure. If that can be offered into the entire global south, that can help countries a lot, populations a lot, and as well create opportunities for Indian companies.
Ajay, stay with us because Pramit Chaudhuri is also here. And Pramit, before I let you go, I want to take that stand of what Gautam Chikermane said. Teddy bears and T-shirts from China, but technology from the United States. How would you respond to that, and what would you add?
I mean, he's basically correct. In terms of low-end manufacturing, low-value manufacturing, China still dominates supply chains, though I would say Bangladesh, Vietnam are starting to move in. T-shirts are now more likely to come from Bangladesh than they are from China. But what we're really looking for, what India wants, I'd like to do that as well, but we really want is high-end manufacturing jobs, particularly in Apple's iPhones, for example, roughly 10% are now being assembled here. And we want to spread that across electronics and eventually into other sectors. And you can see that in the Sino-Indian trade figures remain very high. They haven't really fallen at all. In fact, have jumped because low-end manufacturing continues to come in from China. But Chinese FDI into India has collapsed. In last fiscal year, Chinese FDI into India fell by 74%. And that's not because China didn't want to put money. It was because India didn't want to have Chinese money. And we're starting to see this across the world. Large portions of the world are now putting up barriers to Chinese products, to Chinese investment, and Chinese export figures are starting to suffer. They were used to be about 16% of global trade. I think they've fallen to about 11. And this is starting to impact the Chinese economy. There are huge problems domestically in China, but the fact that its export numbers are not doing very well and its FDI numbers have plunged is aggravating a growing economic crisis in China. This is a great opportunity for India because what America has basically signaled, what the Quad has signaled, what Japan has signaled, is that we see that in the future of technology, India is the emerging economy partner of choice. It has the manpower capacity, it's getting the infrastructure capacity, but it is in the perfect space geopolitically because of its bad relationship with China and its bettering relationship now increasingly with the West.
Pramit, very quick point. When bullies are pushed into a corner, most of them become more aggressive. Is that what we can expect from China vis-a-vis us?
It's a good question, and we don't know yet. It is something that is being debated by many capitals in the world, that if given where China's economy is going, increasing reports that Xi Jinping is facing difficulties within his own party, does he externalize this and divert attention? When Mao did the Great Leap Forward in 1958, a complete economic disaster, faced a potential revolt in his own party. We saw him attack India in 1962. We saw him capture Tibet in 1958. We saw him even take on the Soviet Union in the Battle of the Ussuri River. Is that something that we need to be worried about? Yes. And that's one of the reasons you still see over about 160,000 Indian soldiers still facing Chinese at forward positions across the Chinese border. And if you look at the defense budget of every single one of China's neighbors, other than Russia and North Korea, it's accelerating. I was recently in Japan, had a discussion with their Ministry of Defense. Japanese defense expenditure will be about $400 to $500 billion over the next 5 years. They will become the third largest military in the world in just 5 years' time. And when I said, but you don't have any people, they said, we are creating the first unmanned robot army in the world. We are militarizing. Japan is going completely against its World War II pacifism, all in response in preparation for what they fear is going to be a major blowout from China.
Thanks for sharing that information, Pramit. And I know this is a subject that we would need to discuss more, but for now I'll thank you and come back to you hopefully in the future. Ajay Bhaga, thank you for listening into this non-market perspective, but you would agree that the markets always take a long-term view and investors should take a long-term view. From all that we have heard, and all of this is medium to long-term implementation from the G20 and the bilaterals, what should investors be looking for as the key takeaway at the macro level?
I think the biggest thing, Siddharth, is that our time has come. India, just look at the scale of India, that is now going to rapidly go up. Now, we have heard that story nearly every decade for the last 3 decades, and it has gone up, but not as much as we could have. China has outstripped us 6:1. But finally, there is a confluence of lot of factors, and we've got the infrastructure spending starting to kick in over the last 3 years. Now, those are huge multipliers. You spend in a rupee on infrastructure, you get 6 to 8 times impact on your GDP, and then that keeps on multiplying even further. So we are laying down the pipelines for the rapid growth of the Indian economy. Uh, we are quite confident that we will be a 5 trillion, 10 trillion economy down the line, and the stock market will move ahead of that. So that way, as Indian investors, we are in a good spot for the country, in the country's economic history. Now, where is that growth coming through? Recently, you would have seen one interview of Mr. A.M. Nayak, where he was talking about a 25,000 crore order coming from the Gulf, and there was talk of Saudi Aramco maybe giving L&T an order of $3.9 billion. Again, multi-year contract. These kind of contracts aren't fulfilled over 3 months or 6 months. They run into years. But you know, we have the acumen to execute, and the ability to absorb the scale of such contracts. That's the big change, and we can execute them at much lower cost to global companies. And with China not being a preferred partner for a lot of the world, there is an empty space which India can occupy in global infrastructure building. Capital will come from the Gulf or the West, and we can supply the expertise. Second is our skilled manpower. We do talk about a lot of our youngsters being unemployable and stuff like that, but it doesn't take much to make them job ready, and companies will invest. You would have seen NVIDIA was talking that they have 3,000 Indian engineers already working. They're looking to hire 2,000 more. 2,000 more is no big deal in an education ecosystem like India's. And you look through universities to universities now, the number of BScs on business analytics and data patterns, data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Just yesterday, there was one article where Google is funding and Microsoft is funding professorships in IITs for artificial intelligence, for chat GPT kind of work. So that will accelerate. We will be the suppliers of that kind of human resource, and companies will find it easy to be based in India for given the ecosystem we provide. We are not a Singapore yet. We are not a Hong Kong in terms of ease of doing business. But the IT, we are quite big, and service exports, we are huge now. Total combined would be at $250 billion plus of export earnings that we are making from IT and service exports. So that will only accelerate. But manufacturing is what we have to crack because that's where the maximum jobs will come. Building on the defense part, Siddharth, I think a lot of the future defense spending will go into non-human forms of warfare, where millions of drones can be unleashed, and you can afford to lose a few thousand drones a day and still continue warfare. So more than the human element, it will be the technological hardware and software that will get very important. That's one big learning that has come out of the Ukraine war, where civilian drones have been weaponized to fight the war, to clear mines, to bomb ammunition depots. I think for India also, we'll have to spend a lot more on that IT hardware to create that ability, and which will not have that big a human cost in terms of warfare. So interesting times. I think immediately we'll have some amount of upswing in the railway stocks and the industrial stocks based on what we are seeing coming out of this G20 summit.
In fact, that was going to be my last question to you, but you've already spoken about it, that there is going to be some sort of sentimental uptick on these stocks, even if many of these things will take time to translate on the ground. Ajay Bhaga, as always, thank you very much for your time. We'll come back to you very soon for a conversation
delighted to be on your show.
Open, but for now, thanks
to be
once.
with you after a very long time, Sid. Thanks a lot for calling me. Delighted to be on a show with you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Ajay. Sumant Sinha, Chairman and CEO of Renew, is with us. Welcome, Sumant. It's the third day at the summit. We were hoping that the third day and this time would be when the Delhi Declaration would have come out. Prime Minister Narendra Modi always delivers a good surprise, and the Delhi Declaration, both in its content and its timing, was a big surprise. So I want to begin this chat with you by asking you to sort of tell our viewers the most important thing that you took away from the summit so far.
Well, Siddharth, thank you so much. I see you're sitting in a very nice area. I wonder where that is, whether that's with the flags behind you, but good to see that.
That's the media center.
Okay, good. It's good to see that you're still there. No, look, I think for me, to be honest with you, the biggest takeaway really is in some ways the coming of age of India's diplomacy and India's position geopolitically. Because I think what we've successfully been able to do is to position India right in the front and center of all the global conversations, the important global conversations happening on a wide array of different areas, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it is climate change, whether it is development, whether it's infrastructure building and so on. And I think now I think the world knows that India has a strong voice. I think it will recognize that, and India, I think, will get consulted a lot more. So I think that for me, in some ways, was almost the biggest takeaway from this G20 summit, which, by the way, was conducted flawlessly. Everything seemed to go extremely well. And I think it's been a real win for the Indian government.
Clearly, the declaration, the content within it, the formal aspects of the summit, as well as what happened on the sidelines being very significant, including many of those bilaterals. And a guest on the show earlier, Sumant, said with regard to the India-US relationship that T-shirts and teddy bears from China, but technology from and with the United States. I want you to focus on the green and climate-related part of the Delhi Declaration. Now, this is an issue that's sometimes spoken of in very, very broad stroke terms, and it becomes difficult to comprehend specific progress, especially at a time when climate change is something that the average Indian also has to grapple with sometimes.
Yeah, look, I think there was a lot of substantive material in the Delhi Declaration as regards climate change. And then, of course, there were also the reaffirmation of some of those more high-minded targets. But just to go through the whole list, I think on the first on the reaffirmation of the high-level targets, I think number one, the fact that the G20 countries reaffirmed the 1.5 degrees centigrade target, which I think is important. There's a dwindling room for us to meet that target globally, but certainly there was at least that target came up again. The second thing was that the world should reach net zero, global net zero by 2050, by mid-century. Now, they didn't explicitly say 2050, but mid-century, I guess you can take to imply as being that, which is very significant given that large countries like India and China are looking at net zero after 2050, 2060 and 2070. That means the developed countries have to get there before 2050 for us to meet that target globally. Now, that's a very important statement that I have not seen before so far. Hopefully, the COP28 process takes this whole statement forward. The second thing was there was a very specific target by 2030 that we need to triple renewable energy capacity, which for me was quite a big step forward. Which, of course, ultimately it's not being sort of divvied up into different countries, and not every country signing up to a target and stuff like that. But at least there was, I think, this recognition that renewable energy needs to move forward much faster. In addition to that, there was also the view that energy efficiency needs to play its own role, which is also important. Again, these are relatively high-level statements that ultimately each country will have to do what it needs to within whatever accords that they've signed under the Paris Climate Accord and so on. But certainly that target is there, which then allows us to now look at progress against these targets subsequently. Then there was a whole issue around green hydrogen, the fact that there needs to be a common taxonomy, that we need to encourage more trade in green hydrogen. And then, of course, the setting up of the Green Hydrogen Innovation Center under the International Solar Alliance within India. So I think there's a lot of stuff that is there around the green hydrogen. Then, of course, global biofuels, where there's a clear intent that by mid-century, global biofuels should scale up 3.5 to 5 times from where it is right now. So again, some effort there. But if you're looking for specific tangibles, I think the most important tangibles came through in the area of financing, where multilateral development banks have been laggards in providing financing to the climate change area, which in a lot of cases they say is because their mandates are not strong enough. I think now the G20 countries, which are the major shareholders of the MDBs, have said that whatever changes have to be made at the MDB levels to allow them to lend more should be made. So I think that is step one in making the MDBs much more efficient and effective in lending to the sector. And then, of course, I think the restatement that the $100 billion of climate financing from the developed world to the developing countries has to come through. And in fact, the UK just announced their contribution of $2 billion to that fund. So I think you'll see tangibility around the $100 billion. You'll see tangibility around the MDB reform process and there being more active lenders. And then I think you'll see a lot of hopefully push that each country will do to the others through forums like COP20 and other G20 forums on the 1.5 degrees and the get into global net zero and pushing forward on green hydrogen. So I think quite a lot of things all in all.
Sumant, you've given us a very detailed look into what you think is important. I want to ask you a question. Given that you spend a lot of time interacting with industry, not just in India, but globally, how would all that has happened at the G20 translate into impressions for global corporations? There was a massive B20 gathering in Delhi. I spoke to several people who were here. The mood is for India, but sometimes there are always these dark shadows around the clouds. With the G20 and all that came out of it, how would global investors and corporates be looking at this?
Well, look, I think, it's very clear now that India is very significant from a global economic standpoint. We are now the 5th largest country economically. We are going to become the 3rd largest very soon. If you look at the share of GDP growth of the world, India is beginning to contribute a bigger and bigger share of that. And I was just reading somewhere that now India is going to start contributing a larger amount to global GDP growth than China is going to be doing. And that's going to be a very significant tipping point when that happens in the next couple of years' time, because that means that the largest amount of new market demand will come from India. And that means that whether anybody likes it or not, they will have to come into India, given the size of the market and given the growth opportunities that it is providing. So I think that is why you see India becoming more and more central in the discourse around where corporations want to invest. And then, in addition to that, if you look at the whole issue of supply chain diversification, which is yet an additional factor, in terms of how the sort of corporations, large corporations, are looking at the future manufacturing, especially, I think there India has to become a very important part of the solution. And I think that is why you see many more large companies thinking about setting up large manufacturing systems in India. As far as climate change is concerned, India will be a very large market for clean energy, which is very clear. We will also be a very large market, among the top two or three biggest markets in the world, for green hydrogen. And we will also essentially be a provider for solutions around supply chain diversifications by getting into solar module manufacturing, by getting into electrolyzers, and perhaps eventually into batteries as well. So I think we can really become a solution provider to the rest of the world, in addition to being a large market. So I think from that standpoint also, India is becoming more and more central to the whole climate change discourse that is going on globally, especially among corporations.
Sumant, and absolutely, Sumant, and not just for renewables, but if you take a broader picture of what Apple has been witnessing on its stock, the hammering that it has received, and the hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap erosion on account of curbs being put in China, it's a clear example of how global corporations are now faced with the hard reality that it cannot just be China. Sumant Sinha, I'm going to thank you for sparing our time this Sunday afternoon and talking about the G20 Summit. Thank you for being with us today. Viewers, we are now coming to the end of our coverage here from the summit. A lot of the deliverables we've been showcasing to you, taking you through the details and getting you expert views and commentary on the economic agenda, the finance track, which is where most of the accomplishments of this summit have come out from. The Russia war, Ukraine, the distractions, the doubts with regard to whether there will at all even be a declaration, all of them are behind us. The organization of this summit has been brilliant. The media center here, a massive one, the largest that I have seen ever in India for any event. And I can tell you, viewers, also among the most big media centers that I have seen in overseas events. I have covered almost 5 international G20 summits, and I can tell you that the sense of optimism and confidence, viewers, that the Indian officials showcased was not just a normal routine, we have to get this done because this is a rotational presidency. Through the year, the effort, the time that has been invested by the government with Prime Minister Narendra Modi leading from the front, the dozens and dozens of separate smaller events that have been held, the outreach that has been done with the G20 countries, having shown them different parts of India, not just, the national capital. I could go on and on and on about how every single rupee that has been spent on India's G20 presidency is a rupee that will deliver multi-year, multiple dividends. To use stock market terminology, it could probably be called a multi-bagger for Bharat. But as I wind down our coverage and thank all those working behind the camera, our colleagues in the studio, our cameramen, our colleagues in assignment, other reporters and anchors from the Business Today team and the overall Business Today multiverse, I want to leave you, viewers, with one final act of the G20 presidency, which is Prime Minister Narendra Modi formally handing it over to Brazil. We'll see you again. As I leave you with these visuals, I wish you all the very best. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
मैं ब्राजील के राष्ट्रपति और मेरे मित्र
the President
लूला डी सिल्वा को
and
हार्दिक
friend,
शुभकामनाएं देता हूं
De Silva.
और मैं उनको
And now I
प्रेसिडेंसी का गेवल सौंपता हूं। मैं राष्ट्रपति लूला को इस अवसर पर अपने विचार साझा करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।